It doesn't come back all at once. It doesn't announce itself. There's no warning, no signal, no clear moment you can point to and say, "This is when everything started slipping." It starts quietly, subtly, almost politely. One thought, that's all it takes. Maybe I'm just a little hungry. And at first you don't question it, because hunger is normal, right? Hunger is human. Hunger is something you've learned to live with your entire life. But this feels different. This doesn't feel like the old chaos, not yet. It feels small, manageable, easy to ignore. So you brush it off, you drink some water, you distract yourself, you move on. But then it comes back, not louder, not stronger, just again and again and again. And suddenly you notice something that unsettles you more than the hunger itself. The silence you once had is no longer silent, because for a while, things were different. When you first started, there was peace, real peace. The kind you didn't even realize you were missing until it arrived. Food stopped being the center of everything. The constant calculations, the cravings, the background noise that followed you into every room. It all faded. You could walk past food and not feel pulled. You could sit with your thoughts and not have them hijacked by cravings. You could exist without that voice narrating your next meal. And it felt like freedom, like you had finally stepped outside of something that controlled you for years. So when the noise starts creeping back in, it doesn't just feel like hunger. It feels like something is being taken away from you. And that's where the real fear begins, because now your mind starts racing. Is it wearing off? Is my body adapting? Am I going backwards? What if this stops working? And just like that, the calm you built begins to crack. Not because you failed, but because uncertainty is louder than logic. And the truth is, what you're experiencing right now is not failure. It's not weakness. It's not your body betraying you. It's something far more complex and far more human. Because what people call food noise is not just about hunger. It's not just about appetite. It's a deeply wired system inside your brain, shaped by years of habits, emotional associations, reward pathways, and survival mechanisms. And when you started your journey, that system didn't disappear. It simply quieted down, temporarily. The medication helped lower the volume, but it didn't erase the wiring. It didn't delete the patterns your brain has spent years reinforcing. So now, as your body adjusts, as your system begins to recalibrate, that old wiring starts to flicker back on. Not at full power, not all at once, but enough for you to notice, enough for you to feel it, enough for it to scare you. And here's the part no one tells you, the part that can change everything if you understand it. The return of food noise is not the end of your progress. It's the beginning of a new phase. A phase where the external support you relied on begins to share space with internal awareness. A phase where you are no longer just reacting, but learning, observing, understanding. Because this is where the real shift happens. Not when everything is quiet and easy, but when the noise returns and you choose how to respond to it. And right now, you are standing in that exact moment. The moment where most people panic. The moment where doubt creeps in. The moment where it feels like you are losing control. But you're not. You're becoming aware. And awareness is the first step to control. So instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" a better question is, "What is this trying to show me?" Because the noise isn't just noise. It's information. It's patterns resurfacing. It's habits revealing themselves. It's your brain showing you what it still holds on to. And if you can learn to see it that way, if you can shift from fear to curiosity, everything changes. Because now, instead of being pulled by the noise, you start observing it. You start noticing when it shows up, what triggers it, how it feels, how long it lasts. And most importantly, you realize something powerful. You are not the voice. You are the one hearing it. And that distinction changes everything. Because the moment you separate yourself from the noise, the moment you realize that just because a thought appears doesn't mean you have to act on it, you begin to take your power back, slowly, quietly, but surely. And that's where this journey truly begins. Not at the first injection, not at the first pound lost, but right here, in this moment, where the silence breaks and you decide what comes next. What's really happening inside you? What makes this phase so confusing is that on the surface, it feels like something is going wrong, but underneath, something very precise is actually happening. Your body is not failing you, it's adapting. And adaptation is not the enemy, it's the design. From the very beginning, your system has one primary goal: survival. Not weight loss, not aesthetics, not confidence. Survival. And your brain, specifically the parts responsible for hunger, reward, and habit, are constantly scanning for anything that threatens stability. So when you introduced a change, something powerful enough to quiet cravings, reduce appetite, and disrupt long-standing patterns, your body responded the only way it knows how: by adjusting. At first, the change was strong, almost overwhelming in its effect. Hunger dropped, cravings softened. The reward response tied to food became muted. It felt like control had finally been handed back to you. But your brain doesn't interpret that as freedom. It interprets it as a shift that needs to be regulated. So over time, it begins to recalibrate. Receptors adjust, signals rebalance, sensitivity changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, subtly, almost invisibly. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They assume that because the feeling is returning, the solution is disappearing. But that's not entirely true. What's actually happening is that the initial intensity is stabilizing, and in that stabilization, your awareness is increasing. You're starting to feel things again, not because you've gone backwards, but because your system is finding a new equilibrium. And within that equilibrium, all the patterns that were temporarily quieted begin to resurface. Not because they were gone, but because they were waiting for space, waiting for attention, waiting for an opportunity to reappear. And when they do, they don't come back as obvious cravings at first. They come back as thoughts, subtle suggestions. You could eat something, maybe just a little. It won't matter. And these thoughts are powerful because they feel like you. They sound like your voice. They blend into your thinking so seamlessly that you don't question them. But they are not random. They are echoes of learned behavior. Every time in the past that food was tied to comfort, stress relief, boredom, celebration, or escape, your brain created a pathway, a shortcut, a connection that says, this feeling equals that response. And those connections don't disappear just because the volume was turned down for a while. They remain, quiet but intact. So now, as your system recalibrates, those pathways begin lighting up again. Not fully, but enough to remind you they exist. And here's where it gets even more important, because the return of food noise is not just about biology, it's about environment. The world around you hasn't changed. The cues are still there. The habits are still embedded in your daily routine. The same kitchen, the same snacks, the same stress triggers, the same emotional patterns. And when your internal volume begins to rise even slightly, those external cues suddenly become louder again. You notice food more, you think about it more, not because you're weaker, but because your brain is reconnecting signals that were temporarily softened. And this is the moment where most people misinterpret what's happening. They think, I've lost control, but control was never meant to come from silence alone. Silence was just the space you were given to learn. Because if everything stayed quiet forever, you would never build awareness. You would never develop the ability to navigate the noise. You would simply depend on the absence of it. And dependence is fragile, because the moment something shifts, everything feels like it's collapsing. But this phase, the return of the noise, is where resilience is built. This is where you start to see the patterns clearly. You begin to notice that not every urge is hunger. Some are habits, some are emotional echoes, some are environmental triggers. And when you start to distinguish between them, something powerful happens. You stop reacting automatically. You pause, even if it's just for a second. And in that second, you create space. Space between the thought and the action. Space between the urge and the response. And that space is where control actually lives. Not in the absence of noise, but in your ability to choose what to do with it. Because the truth is, the noise may come and go. It may rise, it may fall. Some days will feel easier, others will feel heavier, but the goal was never to eliminate it completely. The goal is to understand it so deeply that it no longer controls you. And that's what this phase is offering you. Not punishment, not regression, but insight. It's showing you exactly where your patterns still exist. Exactly where your triggers are strongest. Exactly where your attention needs to go. And if you can stay present in this phase, if you can resist the urge to panic and instead choose to observe, you begin to build something far more powerful than silence. You build awareness. You build intentionality. You build the ability to hear the noise without obeying it. And that is the shift that separates temporary progress from lasting transformation. Because anyone can move forward when things are quiet. But the real change happens when the noise returns. And you don't let it decide for you. How to silence it without losing yourself. Now that you understand what the noise is and why it's coming back, the question becomes more important than ever. How do you deal with it without falling back into old patterns, without feeling like you're constantly fighting yourself, without turning every moment into a battle of willpower? Because that's where most people go wrong. They try to silence the noise by force. They resist harder. They restrict more. They tighten control until everything feels rigid and exhausting. And for a short time, that might work. You might push through a few days, maybe even a few weeks. But eventually, the pressure builds, the tension grows, and the moment your guard drops, even slightly, everything rushes back in stronger than before. Not because you're weak, but because force creates friction, and friction always finds a breaking point. So the real solution is not to fight the noise, but to understand how to reduce its influence without amplifying it. And that starts with something simple, but incredibly powerful: recognition without reaction. The next time the thought appears, and it will appear, instead of immediately responding, instead of pushing it away or giving into it, just notice it. There it is. No judgment, no panic, no urgency. Because the moment you stop treating every thought like a command, you begin to break the automatic loop that has controlled you for years. And this may feel uncomfortable at first, because you're not used to sitting with the urge without acting on it. But discomfort is not danger, it's just unfamiliar space. And the more you stay in that space, the more you realize something important. Urges rise, but they also fall. They peak, and then they pass. They are not permanent. They are not endless. They are waves. And your job is not to stop the wave, but to let it move through without pulling you under. Now, alongside awareness, you need structure. Not restriction, but structure. Because when your environment supports your goals, the noise has less room to grow. This means simplifying decisions around food, planning meals ahead of time so you're not constantly negotiating with yourself in moments of vulnerability, keeping your environment aligned with your intentions, not filled with constant triggers that demand willpower every time you walk into a room. Because willpower is limited, but structure is sustainable. And then there's another layer that most people overlook completely: nourishment. Sometimes what feels like food noise is actually your body asking for something real. Not sugar, not distraction, but actual fuel, protein, fiber, hydration, stability. When your meals are balanced, when your body feels supported, the intensity of the noise often decreases naturally. Because now you're not just managing your mind, you're supporting your biology. And that combination is powerful. But even with awareness, even with structure, even with proper nourishment, there will still be moments where the noise feels loud. And in those moments, you need something deeper, a shift in identity. Because if you still see yourself as someone who is trying not to give in, then every urge becomes a test. Every moment becomes pressure. But when you start to see yourself differently, as someone who understands their patterns, someone who observes before acting, someone who makes intentional choices, the entire dynamic changes. You're no longer fighting yourself, you're guiding yourself. And that shift removes the tension that keeps the noise alive. Because the truth is, the more you fight something, the more attention you give it. And attention is what feeds the noise. But when you observe it, when you acknowledge it without urgency, when you move forward without reacting impulsively, it begins to lose its power. Slowly, quietly, just like it once disappeared, it can soften again. Not because it's being suppressed, but because it's no longer being reinforced. And this is where patience becomes critical. Because this is not about instant silence. It's about gradual control. It's about building a relationship with your mind that is no longer reactive, no longer chaotic, no longer driven by old patterns. And that takes time. But every moment you pause instead of react, every time you choose intention over impulse, every time you let an urge pass without acting on it, you are rewiring something deeper than behavior. You are changing the pattern itself. And over time, those small moments compound. The noise becomes less frequent, less intense, less convincing, until one day you notice something familiar. Not complete silence, but something close to it. A quiet that feels earned, not given. A calm that comes from understanding, not just intervention. And that's the difference. Because what you're building now is not temporary relief, it's lasting control. And the most important thing to remember through all of this is that the return of food noise was never your enemy. It was your opportunity. An opportunity to see clearly, to understand deeply, to build something that doesn't disappear the moment conditions change. So the next time the thought appears, and it will, don't panic. Don't assume you're losing progress. Don't tell yourself you're going backwards. Instead, recognize it for what it is. A signal, not a command. A moment, not a destiny. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not a perfect choice, not an easy choice, but a powerful one. To listen or to lead. And the more you choose to lead, the quieter everything becomes.